This is Jay Martin.
It's difficult to see how the price of food or fuel is going to come down in the near future, near being like, call it a 5-year time horizon, when you look at all the geopolitical factors and just the constraints and I guess protectionist philosophies that are rolling out around the world in terms of gas and grain. Now, that being the case, we could probably expect prolonged inflation within those necessities, right? Food and fuel. Maybe the discretionary spending prices will come down. The car market might get smashed a little bit. Be curious to know your thoughts on the housing market in that regard. But, if we see continued increase in these necessities, then the quality of life will continue to get more challenging, right? And harder, right? People's affordability of any extras disappears, right? So what is your forecast, I guess, for the real economy, right? Let's just stick with America over the next decade, right? And is it a pretty picture? Is it a challenging one? Like, what do you think, Nomi?
Well, I think in general, and to an extent, as a result of this permanent distortion between money effectively flowing into financial assets and markets on a more rapid basis, and even when it retracts, not going into all of the elements of the real economy that impact people's lives, I think we're going to continue to see this disconnect between markets and the real economy, whether the markets are going up or down. And I do think that we're also going to see inflated prices as long as, again, we have these sorts of geopolitical turmoils that we have right now. And yes, more of an element of both protectionism and also just a reallocation of sort of allies and alliances amongst countries as a result around the world. I mean, we look at what's happening into the winter months and what we expect to happen, or I expect to happen in the winter months in Europe, where you have this, basically sanction against one of its major suppliers that can't not impact the price of oil, the price of natural gas. So the thing is, even if we see prices come down because there are economic slowdowns and less of, let's say, a demand on fuel, we also see that there could be other factors that could pop them back up. Now, that said, I also see that there's going to be an expansion, for example, just staying with energy, in the general field of energy. I do think the pivot, the transition to new energy, alternative energy methods, cheaper methods of storing energy, whether that's from an alternative battery perspective to more of an upgrade to our entire electricity grid. And this isn't just about pivoting to EVs. This is about, in general, coming up with a better balance, a cheaper economic balance of how we produce and use energy in every manner, from transportation at home to keeping our homes heated. And I think what we've seen from this period is that those economies that are related and those investments that are related to that part of the economy, I think will do well in the future years, even if the overall economy staggers relative to markets.
Okay. What is your forecast, or I guess expectation within Europe this winter? Because I'm on the same page. There's been a lot of blustering about weaning ourselves, I'm talking about countries like Germany, off of Russian gas, but they don't have another option. It's easy to say that now in the summer, but temperatures are going to get cold and people are going to need to warm their house. I have to assume, if I was, a citizen in a country like Germany, and I'm expecting things like rolling blackouts as soon as November, December, right? I'm going to look at my alignment, right? And what's there for me if we continue to be an ally of the West? I'm not quite sure. What's there for me if we pivot to becoming an ally of the East? Food and fuel. Well, that's pretty attractive, right? And so, do we see a breakup of the euro and a realignment of the geopolitical chessboard?
That's a really good question. You certainly see that, that the related increased tension amongst people. When you are facing cold and the inability to heat your place or to move about without it really digging into your just general financial stability, that is a problem. If you can't afford food, or food's really prohibitively more expensive, that's a problem that causes all sorts of internal skirmishes and realignments at the domestic polls and that sort of thing. It does. We had, just going into the pandemic period and going into this inflationary period, 2019 was the year of, I talk about this impermanent distortion of kind of the most civil unrest in the most places broadly
Yeah.
around the world. And now it is much more than that. You know, pandemic kind of kept it on a lid, and now it's sort of coming up past that, because people get tense when they can't afford things they need. And that changes politics. And you're right, that changes some realignments. And that's one of the reasons why I think it took a while for Germany to even, you know, come out and say, yeah, we are actually going to sanction our basically number one supplier of yeah, fuel, to this extent. And I think that that can cause more internal fractions. So it will be interesting to see how that turns out. On the same token, the United States has used the higher fuel prices and just the what's happened with respect to Russia and the East, or that region, to say, all right, well, we're going to solidify relationships with Japan, we're going to solidify relationship with Canada, with Mexico, that we already have, but more so in South America, in terms of getting what we need to supply ourselves with food and fuel, and also to more so vilify China for continuing its relationship with Russia, and just in general, because that's what happens between the two powers, between the US and China. And so that bigger superpower alignment is changing with regard to the allies that supply its supply chains,
Right.
as well as looking internally to put more money and more investment, more government investment into domestic supply chains. And that's one of the reasons that you know, we had the bipartisan infrastructure act passed at the end of last year. And it's one of the reasons why, even though it was partisan in terms of its passage, the recent Inflation Reduction Act was passed. Now, I don't think that will actually reduce inflation, but the good thing about it is it does seed fund and produce sort of tax incentives for this area of energy that's at the core of people's needs and geopolitics.